The Baltic Sea in the winter of 1946 was not a place for hope. It was a graveyard, cold, gray, and littered with the remnants of a war that had ended but refused to die. Beneath its churning surface lay thousands of tons of steel, German magnetic mines, Soviet contact mines, drifting torpedoes, unexploded depth charges. The water remembered everything. It swallowed ships whole, tore hulls open without warning, and turned fishermen into widows' husbands in the span of a heartbeat. Lars Anderson knew this better than most. He stood at the edge of the wooden pier in Bornholm, Denmark, his boots caked with salt and ice, staring out at the sea that had taken his brother the previous autumn. The Freya, his brother's fishing boat, had simply ceased to exist one morning. A flash of orange fire, a column of black smoke, and then nothing. The Danish Navy classified it as accidental contact with ordnance. Lars called it what it was: murder by negligence. The authorities had declared the Baltic a restricted fishing zone after the war. Too dangerous, they said. Too many mines. The minesweepers, British, Soviet, Danish, were working as fast as they could, but it would take years, maybe decades. In the meantime, the fishing communities that had survived the Nazi occupation were now dying of starvation and bureaucracy. No fish meant no money. No money meant no food. The children were getting thinner. Lars was 42, weather-beaten, with hands like gnarled oak and eyes that had seen too much. He had fished these waters since he was 12. He knew every current, every shoal, every place where the cod ran thick in spring. But now the sea was forbidden to him. His boat, the Havru, sat idle at the dock, her nets rotting, her engine cold. It was on a Tuesday morning, under a sky the color of wet concrete, that Lars made the decision that would change everything. He stood in his workshop, a cramped shed that smelled of diesel fuel and rust, staring at the machine he had been building in secret for 3 months. It wasn't supposed to exist. The device was illegal under the Emergency Maritime Safety Act, a modified naval mine detector cobbled together from salvaged British sonar equipment, German magnetometer parts scavenged from a crashed Luftwaffe reconnaissance plane, and a homemade amplifier built from radio tubes. It looked like something out of a mad scientist's laboratory, a mess of wires, coils, batteries, and a headset that crackled with static. But it worked. Lars had tested it in the shallows near the harbor, dragging it behind a rowboat on a cable. The device could detect metallic objects buried in the seabed up to 15 meters deep. When it passed over something large and ferrous, like a mine casing, the headset emitted a sharp, piercing whine that made your teeth ache. "You're going to get yourself killed," said Mikkel, his oldest friend and deckhand. Mikkel stood in the doorway of the workshop, his face shadowed with concern. "Or worse, arrested. The Brits have been clear. Unauthorized mine detection is a criminal offense. They'll seize your boat. Maybe even shoot you if they think you're salvaging ordnance." Lars didn't look up. He tightened a bolt on the detector's frame, his breath misting in the cold air. "They can't arrest all of us, Mikkel. The whole coast is starving. Someone has to do something. Let the Navy do it. The Navy doesn't care about us. They care about shipping lanes. They're clearing the routes to Gdansk and Kiel. They're not clearing our fishing grounds." Mikkel stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "If that thing malfunctions, if it sets off a mine—" "It won't," Lars interrupted, his tone final. "I've calibrated it. It doesn't send an electrical pulse. It's passive detection only. The mines won't even know it's there. And if you're wrong?" Lars finally looked up, his eyes hard. "Then I'll die doing something that matters instead of sitting here watching my children go hungry." The silence between them was heavy. Outside, the wind howled off the sea, rattling the shed's tin roof. Somewhere in the distance, a gull cried, a lonely, mournful sound. Mikkel sighed and rubbed his face. "When do we leave?" "Tonight," Lars said. "Low tide. No moon. The patrol boats won't see us." The Havre slipped her moorings at 2 a.m., her engine barely audible over the crash of the waves. Lars stood at the wheel, his face illuminated by the faint green glow of the compass. Mikkel was in the stern, securing the Detector to its cable rig, a heavy spool of steel wire that would lower the machine into the water behind the boat. The sea was rough, chopping against the hull with a rhythmic violence. The air tasted of salt and diesel. No stars. No lights from shore. Just the black water and the distant rumble of the surf. Lars guided the boat northwest, away from the harbor, toward the fishing grounds his family had worked for 3 generations. The area was marked on British charts as Zone 7 Delta, extreme hazard, no passage authorized. But Lars knew these waters. He knew where the mines were likely concentrated, near the old German defensive positions, in the shipping channels the Kriegsmarine had protected. He would start in the shallow reefs, where the mines had drifted after the war, caught in the currents and lodged in the rocks. If he could map even a small corridor, just enough safe water for the local boats to fish, it would be worth the risk. "Detector ready," Mikkel called out, his voice tight with nerves. "Drop it," Lars ordered. The spool whirred as the cable unreeled, the Detector sinking into the black water with a soft splash. Lars put on the headset, adjusting the earpieces. Static filled his ears, a constant hiss, punctuated by the occasional pop of interference. He waited, holding his breath. And then, there. A high-pitched whine, sharp and clear, cutting through the static like a knife. Lars's heart slammed against his ribs. He throttled back the engine, reducing speed to a crawl. The whine grew louder, more insistent. He checked the depth gauge, 12 meters. He checked the chart. They were right over the reef. "We've got one," he said quietly. Mikkel's face went pale. "Where?" 30 meters ahead. Port side. Lars steered carefully, watching the intensity of the signal. The whine peaked, then began to fade as they moved past the object. He marked the position on his chart with a pencil, a small red X. 1 mine located. 1 death trap avoided. "How many more do you think are out here?" Mikkel whispered. Lars didn't answer. He didn't need to. They both knew the truth. Hundreds. Maybe thousands. And they had just begun. The first week was a nightmare of sleepless nights and raw nerves. Lars and Mikkel ran the Detector sweeps in the darkest hours, slipping out of harbor when the patrol boats were docked or distracted. They moved in a grid pattern, covering a narrow corridor of the fishing grounds, painstakingly slow, agonizingly dangerous. Every ping of the Detector sent a jolt of adrenaline through Lars's veins. Some signals were strong and clear, large objects, almost certainly mines. Others were faint and ambiguous. Could be scrap metal, could be an unexploded torpedo, could be the rusted anchor of a sunken barge. There was no way to know for certain without diving down to look, and that was suicide. So Lars did the only thing he could. He marked everything. His chart became a constellation of red XS, each one representing a potential death. He noted the depth, the signal strength, the approximate size. He recorded the tide conditions and the currents. Slowly, painstakingly, a picture began to emerge. The mines weren't randomly scattered. They were clustered in defensive patterns, legacy of the German Kriegsmarine strategy to protect the invasion routes from the Soviet Navy. The heaviest concentration was in the northern approaches, where the water deepened sharply. But there were also stragglers, lone mines that had drifted on the currents, lodged in unexpected places, waiting like sleeping predators. By the end of the first week, Lars had mapped a small safe corridor, barely 200 meters wide, through the reef zone. It wasn't much, but it was enough. He began quietly passing the information to other fishermen, marking their charts in whispered conversations at the dock. At first, they were skeptical. Some thought he was insane. Others thought he was lying. But then Olaf Jensen took his trawler out into the corridor Lars had cleared, and he came back with a hold full of cod. The next day, 3 more boats followed. By the end of the second week, a dozen boats were fishing the safe zone. The word spread. Lars Anderson had done what the governments couldn't or wouldn't do. He had given them back their livelihood. But success brought attention. It was a Tuesday morning when the British patrol boat appeared. Lars and Mikkel were 2 miles offshore, running a new sweep pattern, when they heard the deep rumble of diesel engines approaching fast. "Shit," Mikkel hissed. "Pull up the detector." "Now." Lars killed the engine and yanked the headset off. Mikkel scrambled to haul in the cable, the spool screaming as the detector rose through the water. They barely had it aboard and covered with a tarp when the patrol boat pulled alongside, a Royal Navy motor launch, gray and bristling with mounted machine guns. A young lieutenant stood on the deck, his uniform crisp despite the spray. His face was hard, but his eyes betrayed his youth. Maybe 25, fresh from the war, still learning how to command. "Cut your engine and prepare for boarding," he called out, his accent clipped and authoritative. Lars raised his hands slowly, keeping them visible. "We're just fishing, sir. No trouble here." "This is a restricted zone," the lieutenant said, not buying it. "You're in violation of Emergency Order 447. Do you have authorization to be here?" "We have fishing licenses," Lars replied carefully. "Not for this zone, you don't." The lieutenant gestured, and 2 sailors boarded the Havru, rifles slung but hands ready. They began searching the deck, poking under tarps, checking the hold. Lars held his breath as one of the sailors approached the detector. The man lifted the corner of the tarp, frowned at the tangle of wires and metal beneath it, then let the tarp drop. He didn't recognize what he was looking at. To an untrained eye, it just looked like scrap. "What's this?" the sailor asked. "Old radio equipment," Lars said smoothly. "I repair them. Sell them in town." The sailor grunted and moved on. The lieutenant studied Lars for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he spoke. "I'm going to give you a warning this time. If I catch you out here again without proper authorization, I'll impound your boat and arrest you. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir." "This water is full of mines, Mr. Anderson. You're risking your life and the lives of your crew. Let the professionals handle it." Lars bit back the retort that rose in his throat. He simply nodded. The patrol boat pulled away, engines roaring, leaving the Havru bobbing in its wake. Mikkel exhaled slowly, his face pale. "That was too close." "They didn't find it," Lars said, staring after the patrol boat. "They will, eventually. And when they do, then we need to work faster." The close call changed nothing. If anything, it made Lars more determined. He began operating during daylight hours, gambling that the patrol boats would be too busy with other sectors to notice one fishing boat among dozens. He recruited 2 more men, Jens and Henrik, both young, both desperate for work, and trained them to operate the detector while he piloted the boat. The mapping expanded. They cleared a second corridor, then a third. The safe zones grew, spreading like roots through the minefield. More boats began fishing. The catches improved. The children stopped looking so hollow-eyed. But the mines were relentless. For every corridor they cleared, there were a dozen more death traps waiting. And the detector, pushed to its limits, began to malfunction. The headset crackled with false signals. The batteries drained faster. The cable frayed. It was during the 4th week that they encountered something new. They were running a sweep in deeper water, 15 meters down, when the detector emitted a signal unlike anything Lars had heard before. Not the sharp whine of a standard mine. This was a low, pulsing tone, almost rhythmic. "What is that?" Jens asked, his eyes wide. Lars adjusted the headset, trying to isolate the signal. "I don't know. Could be a magnetic mine with an acoustic trigger." The Germans used them late in the war. Acoustic trigger? Henrik said nervously. Meaning it listens for engine noise? Yes. The three men exchanged glances. So if we get too close, it could detonate, Lars finished grimly. Mikkel, mark this position. We're not clearing this one. We're avoiding it. But as he turned the boat to leave, the signal changed. The pulsing grew faster, more insistent. The detector was picking up something else. Multiple objects, close together. There's more than one, Lars said slowly. This is a cluster. How many? I don't know. 4. Maybe 5. Maybe more. They were sitting in the middle of a minefield within a minefield, a nest of acoustic mines, all connected, all listening, all waiting. Lars's hands tightened on the wheel. He killed the engine, letting the boat drift on the current. Silence fell over the water, broken only by the lap of the waves and the creak of the hull. For 5 full minutes they drifted, not daring to breathe. And then, slowly, the signal began to fade. Lars waited another 2 minutes before restarting the engine, easing the throttle forward with infinite care. They crept away from the cluster, inch by inch, the detector's headset silent in his ears. When they were finally clear, Jens vomited over the side of the boat. That night, back at the harbor, Lars sat alone in his workshop, staring at the map he had created. It was covered in red XS now, hundreds of them, marking the locations of death. Some were confirmed. Others were probable. A few were question marks, too dangerous to investigate. He had cleared 3 narrow corridors. It had taken a month of work, countless hours of fear and exhaustion. And he had barely scratched the surface. The Baltic was still a minefield. The war was still killing people. But Lars Anderson had proven something. It could be done. Not by governments or bureaucracies, but by a single fisherman with an illegal detector and the stubborn refusal to accept that his home waters were gone forever. Outside, the wind howled. The sea churned. And somewhere out there, in the dark water, a mine waited, patient, silent, and deadly. The summons arrived on a cold morning in March. 2 men in dark coats, carrying briefcases and official papers, knocked on Lars's door and informed him that he was required to appear before the Danish Maritime Authority in Copenhagen. The charge: illegal operation of detection equipment in restricted waters. The penalty: confiscation of his boat, a substantial fine, and possible imprisonment. Lars read the summons twice, his jaw tight. He had known this was coming. He had gambled, and now the bill was due. "What are you going to do?" his wife Ingrid asked quietly. She stood in the kitchen doorway, her face drawn with worry. Their 3 children watched from the table, too young to understand but old enough to sense the fear in the room. Lars folded the paper carefully and set it on the table. "I'm going to Copenhagen," he said. "And I'm taking my map." Ingrid's eyes widened. "Lars, they'll arrest you." "Maybe," he said. "But if I can show them what I've done, if I can prove that the mines can be mapped without the Navy's equipment, they won't care. You broke the law." "Then I'll break it again," Lars said, his voice hard. "Because the law is starving us." Copenhagen was gray and imposing. The government buildings clustered along the waterfront like fortresses. Lars arrived by train, carrying a leather satchel that contained his detector schematics, his mine location charts, and a folder of testimonials from the fishermen who had used his safe corridors. The hearing was held in a small administrative office, presided over by 3 officials, a Danish naval officer, a representative from the Ministry of Transport, and a British liaison officer, the same young lieutenant who had boarded the Havre weeks earlier. Lars sat across from them, his hands folded on the table, his expression calm. The naval officer spoke first, his tone formal and cold. "Mr. Anderson, you are here to answer charges of illegal operation of detection equipment in a designated hazard zone. Do you acknowledge these charges?" "I do," Lars said. "And do you have anything to say in your defense?" Lars opened his satchel and spread the charts on the table. The room fell silent as the three officials leaned forward, studying the constellation of red marks, the notations, the careful grid patterns. "These are mine locations," Lars said quietly. "I have identified and mapped 372 potential mines in the waters off Bornholm. I have cleared 3 safe corridors, totaling approximately 12 square kilometers. Because of this work, 19 fishing boats are now operating safely in zones that were previously too dangerous to enter. No vessels have been lost. No lives have been lost." The Ministry of Transport representative frowned. "How did you obtain this information?" "I built a detector. Passive magnetic and acoustic sensors based on Royal Navy specifications. It doesn't trigger mines, it only listens for them." The British lieutenant leaned back in his chair, his expression skeptical. If such a device were effective, the Navy would already be using it. "The Navy is using it," Lars countered. "But only on the main shipping lanes. Not in the fishing grounds. You don't care about us." "That's not true." "Isn't it?" Lars's voice rose slightly. "How many minesweepers are currently operating off Bornholm? How many are assigned to the fishing zones?" The lieutenant hesitated. "Operational deployments are classified." "The answer is 0, Lars said flatly. "You're clearing the routes to Germany and Poland. You're protecting commercial shipping. But the fishermen, the people who live here, who depend on these waters, you've abandoned us." The naval officer's face darkened. "Mr. Anderson, your actions, however well-intentioned, are illegal and dangerous. You are not trained in mine disposal. You do not have authorization. You are risking lives, including your own." "I'm saving lives," Lars shot back. "More than you have." The room erupted. The officials spoke over each other, voices rising, papers shuffling. The British lieutenant stood, his face flushed with anger. "This is unacceptable. You cannot simply—" "Gentlemen." The voice was quiet but commanding. Everyone turned. The Ministry of Transport representative, an older man named Peterson, with gray hair and sharp eyes, raised a hand. "Let him speak." The room settled. Peterson looked at Lars, his expression unreadable. "Tell me, Mr. Anderson, if we were to take your charts, if we were to verify your data, what would you want in return?" Lars met his gaze. "Permission to continue. Official authorization for civilian mine detection operations in the fishing zones. And equipment. Real equipment, not scrap metal and radio tubes. If you give me that, I can clear the entire Bornholm sector within a year." Peterson smiled faintly. "You think very highly of your abilities. I've already proven what I can do." The naval officer shook his head. "This is absurd. We cannot simply—" "Actually," Peterson interrupted, "we can." He tapped the charts on the table. "These are valuable. More valuable than you realize. The British and Soviet minesweeping operations have been inefficient and slow. If Mr. Anderson's methods can accelerate the process, we should use them." "But he's a civilian." Lars broke the surface gasping, ripping off his helmet the moment Mikkel and Henrik hauled him onto the deck. His legs buckled, and he collapsed against the gunwale, his chest heaving, his hands shaking so violently he couldn't hold on to the railing. "You're insane," Mikkel said, his voice raw. "You're completely insane." Lars couldn't respond. He simply sat there, staring at the water, replaying the moment the mine fell, the fraction of a second that had separated him from oblivion. His ears still rang from the pressure, his lungs burned from the thin air, but he was alive. "We need to report this," Henrik said, his face ashen. "Now, before someone else hits that wreck." Lars nodded weakly. "Radio the harbor master. Tell them we found a derelict E-boat loaded with live ordnance. Give them the exact coordinates. And tell them—" He paused, swallowing hard. "Tell them it's critical. They need to cordon off this entire sector immediately." Within 2 hours, the Danish Navy arrived in force. 3 patrol boats, a minesweeper, and a demolition team descended on the site. Lars gave them his charts, his dive notes, everything he had observed. The naval commander, a grizzled veteran named Captain Sorensen, listened in grim silence, then ordered the immediate evacuation of all civilian vessels from the area. "You shouldn't have gone down there," Sorensen said bluntly. "You could have triggered the entire nest." "Someone had to see it," Lars replied. "You would have sent a team in blind." Sorensen didn't argue. He simply nodded once, a gesture of grudging respect. "The demolition will take 3 days. We'll have to set shaped charges and detonate the wreck in a controlled sequence. If we do it right, the mines will go off underwater without damaging the harbor. And if you do it wrong? Then half the coast will feel the shock wave." The controlled demolition was scheduled for dawn on April 12th. The authorities evacuated the harbor and the nearest coastal villages. Lars and his crew were ordered to stay ashore, but he stood on the cliffs above the bay, watching through binoculars as the Navy boats positioned themselves around the wreck site. The sun rose slowly, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. The sea was calm, almost glassy. It was a beautiful morning, too beautiful for what was about to happen. At 6:15 a.m., the demolition team detonated the first charge. The explosion was immense. A column of water erupted from the sea, towering 50 meters into the air, black and churning. The shock wave rolled across the water like a living thing, shattering the calm, sending waves crashing against the shore. Then came the secondary detonations, the mines going off in a chain reaction, each explosion feeding into the next. The water boiled. The air shook. The sound was not a bang but a sustained roar, like the earth itself was tearing open. Lars watched, transfixed, as the sea vomited steel and fire. The E-boat's hull disintegrated, blown to fragments. Debris rained down, twisted metal, shattered wood, shrapnel that hissed as it hit the water. And then, slowly, the explosions subsided. The water settled. Smoke drifted across the bay, acrid and thick. It was over. Captain Sorensen's voice crackled over the radio, calm and professional. Target neutralized. All secondary ordnance detonated. Sight is clear. Lars lowered the binoculars, his hands trembling. They had done it. The wreck was gone. The mines were gone. The waters were, finally, safe. In the weeks that followed, Lars's work gained national attention. The newspapers ran stories about the fisherman who cleared the Baltic, and government officials who had once threatened to imprison him now lined up to shake his hand. The Danish government officially commissioned him as a civilian mine consultant, and the British Royal Navy, grudgingly, began sharing their ordnance charts with him. More fishermen were trained in detection techniques. More corridors were cleared. By the end of 1946, the Bornholm fishing grounds were declared 90% mine-free, and the catches returned to pre-war levels. But the cost had been heavy. Lars's detector, pushed beyond its limits, finally broke down completely in June. His boat, the Havru, had taken such a beating from the rough seas and constant operations that it needed a full overhaul. And Lars himself, physically, mentally, emotionally, was exhausted. He stood on the pier one evening in late summer, watching the fishing boats come in, their holds full, their crews laughing and alive. Children played on the beach. Gulls circled overhead. The sea was still gray, still cold, but it was no longer a graveyard. Mikkel approached, carrying 2 bottles of beer. He handed one to Lars without a word, and they stood in silence, watching the sun set over the Baltic. "Do you regret it?" Mikkel asked finally. Lars thought about the question. He thought about the sleepless nights, the terror, the close calls. He thought about the mine falling, the bolt snapping, the moment he had almost died. "No," he said quietly. "I don't regret it." "Why not?" Lars took a sip of beer, the cold liquid cutting through the salt taste in his mouth. "Because we had a choice. We could have waited for someone else to save us. We could have starved quietly, followed the rules, and hoped the government would remember we existed." He paused, his eyes distant. "Or we could save ourselves." Mikkel nodded slowly. "You're a stubborn bastard, you know that?" Lars smiled faintly. "I've been called worse." In the years that followed, Lars Anderson continued his work, expanding the mine-clearing operations throughout the Baltic. He trained dozens of other fishermen, established civilian detection cooperatives, and became a consultant for multiple governments. By 1950, he had personally mapped and cleared over 2,000 potential mine sites. He never spoke much about the danger, the fear, or the moments when death had been inches away. To him, it was simply work, necessary work, work that no one else had been willing to do. In 1953, the Danish government awarded him the Medal of Maritime Service, a quiet ceremony attended by fishermen, naval officers, and the families whose lives he had saved. He accepted the medal with a nod, then went back to work. Lars Anderson died in 1987, at the age of 83, in his home overlooking the sea. His funeral was attended by hundreds, fishermen, sailors, government officials, and children who had grown up eating fish from the waters he had cleared. The Baltic still holds mines, thousands of them, rusting and dangerous, waiting in the deep. The work of clearing them continues to this day, carried out by governments and navies with advanced technology. But it was a single fisherman, with an illegal metal detector and the refusal to accept that his home was lost, who proved it could be done. He didn't wait for permission. He didn't wait for rescue. He built his own machine, mapped his own waters, and saved his own people. And in doing so, Lars Anderson reminded the world that sometimes the greatest acts of heroism are not grand gestures or government decrees. Sometimes, heroism is simply a stubborn refusal to give up. Sometimes, it's a fisherman with a homemade detector, staring into the dark water, and deciding that the sea will not take one more life. Not today. Not ever again.